So there are some movies that you remember because they were great. And then there are some movies that you remember because somewhere along the way they became a part of you. For a certain generation of Bollywood audiences, Awarapan is one of those films. Released in 2007, Mohit Suri's Awarapan wasn't exactly a conventional blockbuster, but over the years it developed something that is arguably much harder to manufacture, a cult following. And now, almost 2 decades later, with Awarapan 2 bringing Shivam back to the screen, I thought this was the perfect time to go back to the original film. Not just to ask whether Awarapan still holds up, but to ask a much more interesting question. What did Awarapan actually mean for Shivam? Because I think the film gives us an answer that is much deeper than simply being a story about a gangster who falls in love. When we meet Shivam, he looks like a man who has nothing left to lose. He's a gangster, he's violent, he's emotionally detached, and most importantly, he's a man who has already lost the person he loved. Aliyah's death completely changed Shivam. But what's interesting is that even though Aliyah is no longer physically present in his life, she's still everywhere in the film. Shivam carries her memory and, more importantly, the guilt surrounding her death. So technically, Shivam is alive, he's moving, he's working, he's making money, but emotionally, he's stuck. And that's where the word Awarapan becomes important. Because Awarapan simply doesn't mean being a wanderer. It can also mean being directionless, being alive without really knowing where you're going. And that's exactly where Shivam is at the beginning of this film. He's not searching for happiness, he's not searching for redemption, he's barely even searching for a future. He's just simply existing. And then Reema enters his life. But Reema is almost the complete opposite of Shivam. Shivam has freedom but doesn't know what to do with it. Reema desperately wants freedom but doesn't have it. She's a victim of sex trafficking and is being held captive by Malik. And initially, Shivam's involvement with Reema is simply another job, another responsibility, another thing he's being asked to do. But gradually, something changes because Shivam begins to see himself in her. Both of them are trapped, just in completely different ways. Reema is physically imprisoned, Shivam is emotionally imprisoned. And that's when saving Reema stops being just another job for him, it becomes a purpose. There's a beautiful idea running underneath Awarapan. Sometimes you don't find yourself by looking inward, sometimes you find yourself by doing something for someone else. Shivam has spent years drowning in his own guilt, but suddenly he has something outside himself to fight for. He wants to free Reema, he wants to reunite her with Bilal, he wants to give her the life that was taken away from her. And for the first time in years, Shivam has a goal. There's a moment in the film where he says, मलिक साहब जिनके सपने पूरे नहीं होते ना वो दूसरों के सपने पूरे करते हैं. And I think this line tells us almost everything about Shivam. He doesn't believe that his own life can be repaired anymore. He doesn't think he deserves some happy ending. So instead he decides to create one for someone else. And then comes another incredibly important line. मुझे जन्नत में जगह नहीं चाहिए, मैं बस इस लड़की को इस जहन्नुम से बचाने आया हूँ. He isn't trying to become a saint. He's not trying to erase everything he's done. He's simply trying to do one good thing. And perhaps for Shivam, that's enough. This is also why I think Awarapan works better as a story about redemption than as a conventional love story. Yes, Shivam loved Aliyah, and yes, Aliyah's memory is central to the film, but Reema isn't simply a replacement for Aliyah. That's important. Reema gives Shivam something Aliyah's death took away from him, a reason to care again. Through Reema, Shivam starts experiencing emotions that he had buried: compassion, hope, responsibility, and eventually sacrifice. He's not saving Reema because he expects something in return. He's saving her because for once he has found something worth fighting for. And this brings us back to the original question. What exactly is Shivam's Awarapan? I think his Awarapan is the absence of purpose. He's wandering because he has nowhere to go. But once Reema enters his life, that changes. His life finally has a destination, not for himself but for someone else. And that's why the ending hits so hard, because Shivam eventually understands that his purpose isn't to survive. His purpose is to make sure Reema survives. He has already accepted that he may not have a future, and that's what makes his sacrifice so much more powerful. When he says, अपने लिए ये अवारापन का बोझ अब मुझसे और नहीं उठाया जाएगा, मेरे लिए रुक जाना ही मेरी मंजिल है. It's not just a cool dialogue. It's about the completion of his entire character arc. The man who spent the entire movie wandering finally knows where he wants to stop. And maybe that's why this film has survived for almost 20 years. Because underneath the gangster story, the romance, the violence, and the melodrama, Awarapan is ultimately about something very human. What happens when you lose your purpose? What happens when the person you built your life around is suddenly gone? What do you do with all that guilt? And can you ever redeem yourself? The film doesn't necessarily tell us that can you undo your past. Shivam can't, but it does suggest something else. You can choose what you do with whatever time you have left. And sometimes that's enough. Which now brings us to Awarapan 2, and honestly, that's what makes the sequel interesting to me. Because the original film gave Shivam an ending, a very definitive one. So bringing this character back raises an obvious question. What more is there to say about Shivam? Is Awarapan 2 going to recreate the emotional magic of the original, or will it explore a completely different chapter of Shivam's story? Because the biggest challenge for the sequel isn't action, it isn't music, it isn't even recreating the atmosphere of the first film. It's finding a new emotional reason for Shivam to exist. So the original Awarapan was about a man who had lost his purpose and eventually found it by saving someone else. So if Awarapan 2 wants to truly justify its existence, it needs to give Shivam a new journey, a new conflict, and most importantly, a new meaning to his Awarapan. So before Awarapan 2 arrives, I'd love to know, what does Awarapan mean to you? Is it the story, the music, Emraan Hashmi's Shivam, or Mohit Suri's direction, or Mustafa Zahid's songs? Or is it simply one of those films that takes you back to a particular time in your life? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're excited for Awarapan 2, after all these years, let's see where Shivam's Awarapan takes him next.